Okay, welcome everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. Really like the camera might zoom in on in a minute. I'm Professor Rodney Vickers. I'm the Dean at Nantian Institute. But as we begin, I'd like to, in the spirit of reconciliation, Nantian Institute acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we walk, study, and reside, the Wadi people of the Dharawal Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend those respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders of today. Welcome to you all. I'd like to offer a special welcome to our distinguished speakers today, Bharti Sujato and Associate Professor Nicholas Van Dam. And online, we hope to have Josh Sabana Mazagi. So please offer a special welcome to them. We've got a little history of what Nantian is about. Nantian Institute was launched in 2011 within the grounds of the Nantian Buddhist Temple in Wollongong, Australia. Nantian Institute is a private, not-for-profit provider. We're accredited by the Australian Government's Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency. We are now located directly opposite the Nantian Temple. Students and visitors of Nantian enjoy stunning views of the temple to the east and the Illawarra Escarpment to the west. And certainly those of us in the room can look out to the west there to see the view there of the escarpment. Our teaching is informed by the principles of contemplative education and fosters an environment for holistic learning. Society is becoming increasingly governed by overwhelming information and quick social media feeds. AI promises to help us collate that information. What we increasingly need is the ability to stop and reflect. To me, this is what contemplative education is all about. I also believe that it helps that this institute is anchored in a strong foundation. And to tell us a little bit about the foundation of Nantian Institute, I'll hand over to Venerable Miao, who will give a perspective of the foundation of Nantian Institute and also lead us in a brief meditation. Miao.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rod Vickers. Master Hsing Yun, the late Master Hsing Yun, started 5 universities in the world. He himself has never received any formal education. And so he realized that education is very important for anyone who wants to get ahead in society. So education changes one's life. And that's why he established 5 universities in the world, 2 in Taiwan, 1 in the United States, Los Angeles, and Nantian Institute is the 4th member, and Manila is the 5th one. So I'd like to, if I may, carry on and relate to you what the founder, Master Hsing Yun, has said about meditation or mindfulness. So he said that meditation is an essential part of Buddhism. But no one should think that meditation is all that is to Buddhism. So our order, Fu Guan Shan, Nantian Temple, fosters humanistic Buddhism, the integration of our spiritual practice to all aspects of our daily lives, which includes the practice of morality, cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. So the deepest truth that he learned at the meditation hall is that the mind in meditation is the mind of all sentient beings, and that is the mind of all Buddhas. So meditation is the door which goes through that door. What goes through that door is our compassion for others and ourselves. So without further ado, let's start on our short meditation, mindful meditation, or what you call mindful check-in. Okay, so let's get comfortable in our seats. And we take 3 deep breaths. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. So try and relax as you breathe out, letting go. Breathe in and out at your own pace, at your own rhythm, and relax and sink into the chair that you're sitting in, whether you're at home, at work, or in this room. Just noticing the air going into your nose, through your windpipe, and into the air sacs of your lungs. Feeling the sensation of the air going into your lungs and the tummy, rising and falling slowly as you breathe in and out. One breath at a time, one moment at a time, neither fast nor slow, and enjoying each breath, enjoying the waves of calmness washing over in your body and mind. You will notice that thoughts come and thoughts go. Just one moment at a time, and just allowing yourself to be. There is no need to think about anything at all. Allowing yourself to find this quiet space within you, feeling calm and still and tranquil. When we are in this calm, special place, we relax. We continue to observe our breath and allow the calmness to wash over us in body and in mind. Allowing that mindfulness to be present in us. One breath at a time. Relaxing, letting go. Dear friends and students, after this mindfulness exercise, you should be more refreshed and relaxed, more compassionate and open. So before we open our eyes, we should rub our palms together, harness that beautiful energy that you've been cultivating within you, and put it over your eyes, your face, we open our eyes, we'll be more ready to open our minds and hearts as well. So that will get us more refreshed. So take in the Dharma and our knowledge and wisdom from our teachers. So, and venerables, thank you very much. Omnitov. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you so much, Reverend Miayo, and thank you to Professor Rodney Vickers as well, who introduced us and welcomed you all. I'm just waiting for the camera to zoom on me so you can see who's speaking. Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to see you online and also face-to-face. My name is Nadine Levy, and I'm the Program Coordinator for our newly accredited Graduate Certificate in Applied Mindfulness. And so what I thought we might do today is take you through what the course looks like, what you might expect if you're going to enrol in the course. And I'll just do this really briefly. And then we'll move on to the main event, which is really a conversation between three experts and people who I value as leaders in the field of mindfulness in Australia. And I'm sure you're all keen to hear from them. So we'll move on to that shortly. So I also want to acknowledge that we're on beautiful Dharawal country here at the Nantian Institute, just opposite the Nantian Temple. And I would like to acknowledge that Indigenous people have been doing a beautiful job of caring and tending to the land, and also shaping the Nantian Institute and the way we see and view aspects of Buddhism and mindfulness as well. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm here really to launch this new program or certificate, graduate certificate. And this graduate certificate is one of a kind globally. It's one of the very few mindfulness studies courses that is accredited by a government agency, and that focuses on the academic study of mindfulness. And so what we've put together is quite a unique program, which takes an interdisciplinary approach, and it draws from the field of mindfulness studies as an academic critical discipline, compassion science, Buddhist studies, sociology, the science of leadership and coaching, and of course, its Buddhist roots as well. And so we've got a range of experts and individuals teaching into this certificate, including academics in the field of health, psychology, individuals who are very involved in leadership and coaching, sociologists and Buddhist studies scholars. And so I think what's so unique about this program is that you are privy to many different vantage points and approaches when it comes to mindfulness. And what we were really keen to do was combine academic study with experiential experience of mindfulness. And so what we've done in this program is to hopefully impart on our students a deep understanding of some of the theological and doctrinal origins of mindfulness and its role in Buddhist thought. And we've coupled that with an emphasis on how you can apply mindfulness in contemporary society and in relation to the self or in relation to your own experience. And so hopefully by the end of the course, students will be able to critically evaluate evidence in relation to mindfulness, both the benefits, limitations, risks, have an understanding of how to apply mindfulness in a trauma-sensitive context and in a trauma-sensitive way, understand some of the skills that are needed to work with clients, professionals, and other individuals who are wanting to bring more mindfulness into their professional space. And also, we're really keen for students to develop their own practice, deepen in their own practice in a supportive environment with a a group of like-minded community of learners. And so a lot of the course relates to, the evidence and critically evaluating it, synthesizing it, putting it together, developing a good understanding, but also first-person inquiry. So inquiring into your own relationship, experience, reactions, and sometimes unexpected events that can happen on a mindfulness journey. And so during the course of the graduate certificate, you'll have the opportunity to sit a retreat, to engage in reflective journaling and inquiry, and do that with the support of academics and mindfulness teachers. The structure of the course is 4 subjects, and you can do it part-time, full-time, face-to-face, or online, or a combination of both. And at the moment, we're sitting in our hybrid classroom, which is quite exciting. So we can see you and you can see us. And online students are able to interact with face-to-face students. So that's the mode of delivery and teaching for this course. The 4 subjects I just want to mention are applied mindfulness for professionals, and that's the applied component of the course. And that relates to how we understand mindfulness in contemporary times, socially, in an applied way, through the evidence. And you learn a lot about how you might ensure that mindfulness is informed by the evidence, backed by the evidence, and also trauma-informed, so that you're applying it appropriately and minimising risk. Then we've got mindfulness theory and practice, which comes from our Buddhist studies stream, and that really relates to some of the more kind of the roots of mindfulness, I suppose, and how it's understood in Buddhist thought, across Buddhist thought. And the emphasis there is on Buddhist mindfulness meditation. So you'll get a sense of where mindfulness came from and why it matters from a Buddhist perspective. Of course, you don't have to be a Buddhist to take this course, but we think that just for historical purposes and sociological purposes, it's really important that you do get a sense of its history, its genealogy, and its origins. We've got a subject called Mindful and Compassionate Leadership that relates to your own leadership commitment. So making change, positive change, compassionate change in the world, responding to contemporary issues and challenges through the lens of being a mindful leader, an authentic mindful leader. So that's very reflective, looking at your own values and actions in the world. And then lastly, we have a subject called compassionate work, and that really links mindfulness to compassionate action, and it relates to how we might work with our own suffering in our mindfulness practice, because that does tend to come up. So the suffering of self and the suffering of others, and that subject is particularly appealing to those who work in the service professions, those who are in education, those who are in health, who are dealing with other individuals suffering and trying to work through how mindfulness and compassion might be applied and expressed in those settings. So I think it's a fabulous course. I'm very excited by it, and enrolments are now open for it. So I'm delighted to be able to give you some more information about what it might look like. And I'd really invite any questions from anyone who's interested. And the way to inquire about the course is to email study@nantien.edu.au, study@nantien.edu.au. And I think Josh, our lovely IT person, is going to put it in the chat for us. So thank you very much, Josh. And now I'd just like to briefly move over to Professor Vickers.
Okay, thank you, Nadine. Really, I should thank Nadine particularly in terms of creating this course. She's given me both an easy and a hard job, in the sense she said, well, I'm supposed to launch it. Well, I'm not sure how to launch a course. If it was a boat, it's easy enough. You put a bit of champagne on it and it goes into the sea and it's launched at the sea. A rocket you can launch, it goes up into space and it's launched. A building's easy enough to open. You just pull the little curtain and a little plaque comes out and you've opened the building. Nadine, does the course exist? If you get a bit existential here, does it exist already? When TEXA, was it Nadine's mind, or when TEXA accredited it, did it exist then? Does it exist when students are open to enrolment, which is already there? So I think in terms of the dilemma, all I can say is I now declare it launched.
Thank you. That's a very pleasing moment for me and for many others who have been involved. So it does seem like our third panelist, Josh, is online. Savannah, can you find her? If so, can you pin her, please? She's online? Yeah. This is the joys of hybrid. We've got so many of you on the screen. We're looking for one particular person. S-U-B-H-A-N-A. S-U-B-H-A-N-A. There she is. Yay! We're delighted to see you. And great. Perfect timing, Savannah. So hi, everybody. Now we've got this delightful opportunity to listen to three kind of experts, teachers, researchers, and leaders in the field of mindfulness studies in Australia. I'm thrilled to be able to moderate this and put some tricky, spicy, interesting questions to our panelists. And I'm sure you'll be really delighted to hear from them as well. So I've got next to me dear friend Bhante Sujato, who's a senior Buddhist monk, translator and scholar, and author of an excellent book called A History of Mindfulness, which really goes into the kind of genealogy of mindfulness from a Theravadan Buddhist perspective. And then I have to my right Associate Professor Nicholas Van Dam, who's the inaugural director of the Contemplative Studies Centre at University of Melbourne, and also a researcher in his own right in relation to mindfulness and psychology. And he's done some really phenomenal work recently that we'll talk to him about around mindfulness apps, risks in mindfulness, and some of the more kind of neuroscientific aspects of mindfulness. So thank you so much for being here. And then I have another very respected and dear friend, Roshi Sabana Barzagi, who's on the screen with us today. I'm thrilled you can be here as well. She is a Zen Roshi, and she is perhaps one of the first female Zen teachers in Australia. She's also a senior insight meditation teacher and a community mindfulness leader. She trains mindfulness teachers and Buddhist teachers, and she's a therapist as well and a supervisor of therapists. So really great to have this mixed panel. So thank you all. Okay, so let's launch in. There may be time for questions from the floor after I've asked my questions. So hold on to your questions and we'll have some time maybe at the end for them. And I'd like to start with Sabana. So Sabana, I understand you're a teacher both in a Buddhist context and also in a secular context. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you've seen the field change over the last few decades since you've been teaching, and what you'd like to see in the future.
Thank you, Nadine. Can you hear me okay? Yes, all right. Thank you. Wonderful to hear about the launch. I was very impressed with the launch and the course that you have there at Nantian. So I was thinking, wow, things have really changed to have a kind of course like that in an academic institution. So I guess my reflections about how things have changed, what I've witnessed over 50 years now, that I've been practicing in the Buddhist tradition since I was 20 years of age. And I've gone from seeing mindfulness as very much offered in retreat environments in Buddhist retreats in the early days, and attending lots of Buddhist retreats, largely from teachers overseas who came to Australia and Buddhist monks. And so that was the kind of the early beginnings of Buddhism integrating into this culture. And what I've seen is how Buddhism and particularly mindfulness have integrated through a number of different streams into our culture. One of them is psychotherapy and psychology, and it's lovely to see Dr. Enkong Tan on the screen as well. Very seminal in three of us, Jeff Dawson, myself, and Enkong, setting up ABCAP, Australian Association of Buddhist Psychotherapists. And I think we're now into our 6th or 7th 2-year training for therapists in integrating Buddhism, or that dialogical space between Buddhism and psychotherapy. So that's one of the streams that I see mindfulness flowing into our culture and integrating into our Western culture. Another big influence I've seen is how, in many ways, feminism has also had an influence in the West, particularly, where in the early days when I was doing retreats, and largely the teachers or even the leaders in those retreat centers were mostly male, mostly men. And so due to some of my teachers have been very forthright and encouraging and of involving women in leadership positions and roles. And I'm very deeply grateful for Robert Aitken Roshi for that encouragement of women in the Zen tradition stepping forth into leadership roles. And that is that seemed quite radical from the male monastic hierarchical models of that certainly Buddhism has flowed from the East into our culture originally. And so those democratic processes, egalitarian principles, and lay practice is another stream in how I feel that Buddhism and mindfulness is integrating into our culture, into the Western culture. And so that's really, really well developed now over several decades. So the other flavor that I see emerging, of course, is mindfulness, that's also become mainstream. It's not only in various forms of psychotherapy and psychology and that interface, but as mindfulness has flowed into the corporate world and all kinds of manner of various agencies and social and welfare and health and education. So it's it feels like the blossoming of that has really taken root in our culture, in the Western culture. I guess one of the other things that I would like to see, and certainly the course that you laid out there, Nadine, that Nantian is doing, and I feel that the course that Alan and I from the Insight Meditation Institute have developed over the last couple of years, 6 years, is really forging a path of mindfulness and compassion. I feel that while mindfulness is well known and really integrated into our culture, into the mainstream, and there's a lot more research done about mindfulness, mindfulness studies and so on, and we can thank John Kabat-Zinn for some of that too. That's really put mindfulness on the map and in terms of evidence-based medicine and the effects of that. But what has been undeveloped, I feel, is the research and studies on compassion. And to me, they go hand in hand. One without the other is just inadequate for real transformation and change, whether it's in helping others or in terms of liberation for your own happiness and well-being and the liberation of all beings, really. And so without compassion and the Brahmaviharas, the heart qualities, I feel like mindfulness can become very dry, clinical, and just observing experience is not enough for deep, deep healing, personally. And so I've really come to, it's partly why I wanted to organize the Mindfulness and Compassion Teacher Training course, because I wanted to put these two things back together that I always felt was integral to the practice for healing and alleviation of suffering. So the fact that they've been specialized into kind of different areas and techniques, I think, is a problem. I'm interested in what Nan Tian's doing, and those compassion studies are particularly the research that's come out of Stanford University in the Center of Care, Compassion and Altruism and Research and Education. They're doing wonderful work there in really the deep kind of research around compassion as well. So that's where I'd like to see the field emerge and continue to grow in that area.
Thank you, Savannah. Excellent. Yeah. And lovely to hear that there's some alignment between our two courses in valuing the role of compassion and also ethics and compassionate action in society, which I think really addresses some of the issues around, you know, secularizing and psychologizing mindfulness in a more extreme way. So thank you. So now just shifting gears, I'm moving over to Nicholas. And Nicholas, as a mindfulness researcher, I wondered if you could tell us about some of the key obstacles, challenges, and opportunities that you've seen in the field of mindfulness studies over time.
So, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is, and Savannah sort of alluded this already, is that when we talk about mindfulness in a very public setting or context, we use that term very loosely. And so some people, when they refer to mindfulness in a public setting, might be referring to mindfulness within the Buddhist context, within the Eightfold Noble Path. Other people may be referring to it as a very simple, softened, pared back version, which basically just means paying attention. And so this kind of lack of clarity of, you know, on one extreme end, mindfulness embedded in a tradition as part of a path towards a greater good, and on the other end, sort of a technique or a tool that you can use to any ends, whether good or bad, and it doesn't really matter, kind of is often an argument. That makes it really challenging, because when we're trying to study the concept or the idea or the way in which people apply it, if we're not clear on where along that continuum we're interested, you know, what we're trying to look at, it becomes then very hard to know whether or not, when people say I'm talking about mindfulness, whether we're even talking about the same thing. And so this happens quite a lot in the research, which is that people will publish papers or do studies, and they'll say that, you know, mindfulness is related to narcissism. And a paper came out not that long ago saying that, you know, people that are more mindful are more narcissistic. And it turns out that in that particular case, it was this measure of self-reported mindfulness, right? Which is effectively, and often the way we measure self-reported mindfulness is we ask people to say how much you reject the idea that you're not paying attention. And if you say, I reject very sternly the idea that I'm not paying attention, then somehow you say, well, then you must be very mindful. But it's kind of a weird mental gymnastics that happens, which by rejecting this idea that I'm not present, somehow I am present. And so it's very convoluted and complicated. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that's clearly not the same thing as what you do when you engage in a mindfulness-based practice or a mindfulness meditation like we did earlier today. And so this is one of the really big challenges of the field. And it's something that we see in the literature, which is that different studies have different implementations and talk about different results. They say mindfulness is really helpful. There's often a bait and switch with that definition, you know, and it happens a lot with corporate or commercial offerings of mindfulness, where they say there's lots and lots of evidence that mindfulness helps people, therefore use our app. You know, buy this, it's $99.99 a month. It'll help you get enlightenment. And the biggest problem with that is the evidence that they're relying on is on mindfulness-based programs or structured courses that take quite some time to undertake and develop, and you learn a lot and you practice a lot. Whereas what's on their app often bears very little, if any, resemblance to what we've actually studied. So that terminology problem is a really big one, and it's one that we really need to address. There's also other really interesting findings, but I think getting people on the same page and kind of getting people to agree on how we ought to study these terms and terminologies, and even just to think about the goals, is a real challenge. So within Buddhist context, you know, we're practicing towards this greater good for all beings. Within corporate context, it may be something we offer our employees because we don't want to give them a raise or longer breaks or the ability to go to the toilet when they need to. And so comparing those things becomes a real challenge. And so if we don't kind of fundamentally agree that we ought to be looking at one versus the other, and we don't acknowledge the origins of the terms, that it becomes a real challenge. I think we're getting better at that. We're getting better sort of at discussing which version of things are we talking about and which version of things are we studying. But in the popular space, you still see the term kind of used very flippantly. And I think that presents some interesting challenges in terms of how we not only think about what we ought to be doing as researchers, but how we convey what the research can actually support, what the evidence actually is, back to the people that are then implementing these practices in the world.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Nicholas. That was really helpful. And in our conversations recently, you were talking about the fact that at first, particularly with the rise of John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction, people were really fixated on reducing individual stress in their life. And that now we're kind of moving beyond that. We're building on John Kabat-Zinn's work. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what more you think is needed in terms of conceiving of, what mindfulness is and why we do it in a secular setting.
I mean, I think and John Kabat-Zinn sort of admits this in many of his writings, in the last decade or so, sort of when he's talking about the origins of where his program was really coming from. He admits it's Buddhist, and he admits that he used the term mindfulness as a placeholder for all of the Dharma. So he's essentially saying, I kind of used the clever marketing trick to make this accessible to a secular audience. But when he first started it, it coincided with a very strategic move on his part and on the part of those kind of advancing the mindfulness movement, which was the fact that stress research was really taking off. So people like Robert Sapolsky and Bruce McEwen are really coming to the fore in terms of understanding the effects of stress on the body. And all of a sudden, stress became something that got recognized as like a medical problem. People were starting to go, wait a minute, stress can actually change cortisol levels. It can change my brain and can change how I act and behave. And so something that previously, if you think back to, say, World War I, was post-traumatic stress disorder, we didn't even really recognize stress as sort of something that was a condition. People knew they experienced it, but we didn't really talk about it as something that was medicalized. And then in the 80s and 90s, really had this sense of, okay, now stress is a medical issue and problem. And then there was this expertly crafted, perfectly timed package that was mindfulness-based stress reduction. And so people were coming and going, oh, I really want some of that. I have a lot of stress, right? We all have stress. This wonderful, well-packaged program is here for me to manage that stress so that parts of my brain don't shrink. So I think the challenge is now that we come that we're, as I said, we're moving past that. We're sort of people are sort of wanting a bit more. This actually happens quite naturally within offerings like mindfulness-based stress reduction, and with many of the teachers that I've worked with, and when I've sort of been involved with co-teaching myself, about 5 weeks after people do it, the kind of motivation for why they're there starts to shift. There's a sense of, oh, initially I just wanted to feel less stressed, or I wanted to be a little bit more relaxed. But now that I've been doing it for a month or more, it actually feels like there's a lot more going on than just me being stressed. Like the world is a much bigger place and I'm a much smaller part in it. And so then there becomes this sense of, okay, well, what am I doing? Like, why am I here? What is this for? How can I make a difference in the world? And I think that's where the connection to Buddhism comes back into play, is that people start to recognize, oh, actually, maybe I do need some sense of ethics or some sense of moral commitment or obligation. Now, within package programs like MBSR, they're pretty light on in terms of how prescriptive they are with that. But there is a bit of that there, and there is a provocation for you to explore that. But I think what we're starting to get now is a desire amongst people who are pursuing these programs to really explore these things further. Really addressing existential issues, really thinking about big problems that we face in the world. And when you think about, say, healthcare workers or educators or some of the really frontline kind of providers out there, the turnover rates and the burnout rates are massive. And so we have this problem where we can give people the techniques, but to kind of offer and help other people, but we're not necessarily also giving them the purpose in doing the work, nor are we necessarily helping them to think about how to look after themselves in doing it. And I think that goes fundamentally against kind of how mindfulness was originally conceptualized. And I think the way that people like Kabat-Zinn wanted it to be taught, which is experiential in first person, along with sort of third person. So I think that's where we're going, and that's where this needs to shift in a recognition of there are bigger questions that have to be answered. This is not just a tool that we give to individuals. We have to think about those bigger questions, the ethical context and the setting in which we apply these practices.
Sure. And I was also thinking, as you were talking before, about the role of qualified teachers. And there's quite an arduous process, as far as I understand, in becoming an MBSR teacher. And we also know that in Buddhism, the role of a real life teacher was crucial. And perhaps, in this move towards apps and digitalizing mindfulness, we're losing some of that. which I think is an interesting point we might circle back to a bit later. Nicholas, thank you. So, Bhante, I'm moving on to you around some of the social aspects that Nicholas spoke to. So I'm wondering if you can respond to the question around the ways in which mindfulness practice is relevant or maybe even irrelevant. I don't know how you can answer this in relation to current social issues like global conflict, human rights abuses, war, climate change. I could keep listing them, but I don't want to depress you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Nadine. Yeah, no worries, mate. Yeah, that's great. Hi, Savannah. Hey, how you going? Thanks for that. See you. Can I, sorry, look, that's great. I'm really thrilled that you gave me that question. Can I respond to some of the things that the people have said before?
Of course, go for
Because
it.
I picked up a few things there. I just wanted to
Yes,
just engage with a little bit. Is that okay?
please.
Is that all right? Okay, so first one, you mentioned about, I wrote this book, History of Mindfulness, and you said from a Theravada point of view, just a little underscore here, like if I was a psychologist and you called me a psychiatrist, then I'd probably say psychologist. So from an early Buddhist point of view, rather than from a Theravada point of view, Theravadans can't stand that.
Okay, it did come to mind as I was saying it out loud, yeah.
Yeah, Theravadans are very deeply threatened by it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
So, but one of the, I mean, that was a long and complicated, probably unnecessarily so book, but one of the main points that emerged to me from that deep study of the sources was that the original purpose of mindfulness was emotional integration. And the idea that Savannah was talking about, where mindfulness has been I think in the 20th century was kind of stripped of emotionality and became more like an objective technique for uncovering the truth. I mean, that's kind of that's a bit of a parody, that way of presenting it, but there's something to that idea. It was very much kind of neutral feeling, and it was very much, don't get attached to these things. So originally, I think the purpose was emotional integration, what we call samatha, or evenness of mind. And those emotional dimensions of metta, karuna, joy, rapture, all of those are a massive part of that mindfulness practice and is part of that meditative path right from the beginning. So when I hear people talking about, let's do this, I'm saying, yes, to me, that sounds like, let's do what it has been all along. So to me, that's a really nice thing to hear. I also was just really kind of that thing about mindfulness and narcissism was really interesting, because, a lot of people would look at it and then think, oh, that's like, it's like almost heretical, right? Because Buddhism is all about not self, But I have to admit that when I saw that, I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because something I've encountered a lot, right? I mean, there's nobody who has more to say about not self than a narcissist, And if with those kind of tendencies, they will be taken up and they will be amplified through that. And somebody with narcissistic tendencies, obviously that's all of us, right? But it's really easy. In fact, it's almost inevitable, actually, that you're going to amplify those narcissistic tendencies to a degree at stages along the path, right? The problem, you might not necessarily get trapped by it, but at some point you're going to be there thinking, oh, that was a pretty good meditation, right? Yeah, I'm really starting to get this now. And so if you buy into that kind of thing, and then that becomes a huge problem, because then you set up a meditation center and then you write a book and then you do all of this stuff and you have a whole movement, and then that becomes very, very problematic. So I was really happy to see that. Just the other thing, which is probably a bit, maybe a bit kind of broad to discuss here, but both of you have referred to, I think Savannah as well, have referred to the evidence. Yeah. I'm kind of personally, I have to say, I'm becoming increasingly skeptical of the fact of the existence of evidence in psychology because of replication crisis and other kinds of things. And so I'm wondering how we handle that in Dharma education, because I feel like a lot of how to put this, a lot of that, if you like, conventional mindfulness movement has been always argued and justified on the fact that, yes, there are these studies and then they prove that it works and so on and so forth. And it's a very kind of modernist idea that we can establish an objective basis for it. The integrity of that argument to my mind, is measured in the degree to which people actually stop doing that when the evidence no longer supports you, right? I mean, if you say we do this because the evidence supports you, and if the evidence no longer supports you, we'll stop it, we'll try something else now. But I don't really think that people are going to do that. So I'm wondering to what role really that evidence has and how that figures in the narratives that we're developing about mindfulness practices. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. I mean, I think I mentioned sort of the marketing tactic, right? And I think there was a particular approach of thinking about, well, let's build a mechanism or a method by which we can use empirical evidence, scientific methodologies to support or advance something which I think most of the people that were part of that early movement were already firm believers in. So, I mean, that's part of the problem, is that you're saying, you know, from a scientific frame, and if I'm being truly agnostic, I do the studies and I find out whether it works or it doesn't, and whatever happens, happens, right? If I find evidence that supports the thing, great, I do it. If I find evidence that doesn't, then I don't do it. And admittedly, as you're saying, the problem is that, you know, when you start to challenge the nature of the evidence or the types of the studies that are being done, it does start to undermine this idea of, well, we ought to do it because of the evidence. Well, if the evidence isn't really there, then that's just, there's not that argument that that's why you should do it is not very compelling. It's something that comes up in discussion quite a bit of, I think, you know, why do people do these things? And why ought to people to do these things, particularly mindfulness meditation. And to my perspective, in my opinion, I think when we're talking about recommendations writ large, public, healthcare, education, we do need evidence. And I think that that's the case across the board, because if governments are going to provide funding and support for these kinds of programs, we need to know that they do what they claim to do. But when it comes to the individual, the motivations can be very different. So a person can believe that a particular practice is very helpful and useful to them without any objective, quote unquote, scientific evidence. And I don't have a problem with that. And it's all about how, and you know, this is a debate and an argument I've been having a lot, is what is evidence? You know, what counts as evidence? Does your first person experience that meditation helps you become a better person? Can I debunk that? Right. And I might be able to debunk it in my own way, but I may not be able to convince you.
Become a worse person.
But I may not be able to convince you that it does what you want it to do. So, I mean, I think the challenge then becomes, you know, do we continue to toe this line of saying people ought to do it because of the evidence? And I think that's a really important question that we should discuss. And we should say, okay, the evidence that's out there around the brain changes and the evidence that's out there around the clinical trials, they're not probably as compelling as we would like them to be. They certainly don't seem to suggest that people ought to be doing this in place of other common mental health and wellness approaches. And so what it then ultimately comes down to is, well, is there a preference? You know, do people like one better, or is there more reason to think that mindfulness works better than some form of psychotherapy, or people will be more inclined to do it? But speaking to the field and the issue that you're really trying to get at here, what do we do? And I think researchers, I think there's a whole sort of series of steps we're going through to try and kind of check ourselves, really, to say, we're not doing this right. And if things aren't replicating, we have a problem. And so that we're kind of trying to clean house on that side of things. But I think it also requires this broader discussion with the people that are wanting to use the evidence to support implementation of the practice in broader society. And there needs to be a dialogue of like, well, if you're going to try to base your argument on this evidence, you also have to come along on this journey with us as we try to resolve the fact that not all the evidence is as solid as you would like it.
Because the evidence for the other thing is also problematic, right? It doesn't affect mindfulness studies uniquely.
There's also a lot of evidence that mindfulness can be risky for certain individuals and contraindicated in certain contexts. And so, I mean, that's been insightful for mindfulness teachers, I think, in a way. And we've modified the way we teach mindfulness based on that evidence. It's kind of cautionary evidence.
For sure,
Yeah, which I think is incorporated when we talk about evidence-based mindfulness. That cautionary evidence is part of the package.
And you know, when we hear that, that's another thing that people, you know, I think people in the West would read, oh, mindfulness can increase, pose certain risks for mental health and so on. But literally, if you go to any traditional Asian culture, that's what they will tell you. Mindfulness, practice meditation, will drive you mad. if you're not careful. You know, you need to do it with a teacher, you need to do it in the right way, and you need to do it carefully. And this is very common to hear, that people will say that there are mental health risks with doing meditation. Yeah, so this is a piece of traditional law that's been passed down in the community that got swept aside, and then now we're saying, yeah, maybe there's something to it. Yeah.
Well, and I think you're speaking to this broader movement towards, scientism or
Right.
rationalism, right?
Right,
Sort of
exactly,
the
yeah.
way that we go about our lives is on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of belief or sort of, structural
Right.
or cultural commitment.
Yeah.
And that has been a dramatic shift. And I mean, one thing that I often talk about and consider is that I think it is partially that shift that has left people wanting, right? In the sense of, okay, you do this mindfulness class because the evidence suggests you ought to do it. And then you're sitting there and you're looking at yourself and your thoughts, trying to go, well, this is actually what
Right.
I am. Is there anything really here that's tangible? And then you start to actually go, well, hold on a minute, like no one can give me an answer for this. What do I do with this?
Right.
And you ask your psychologist and they can give you kind of somewhat useful or helpful answers. But you're then kind of often looking to religious or spiritual texts or, traditional teachers from the traditions for which he's practicing, coming going, can you please help me? Because
Yeah.
I think you might have an idea as to what I do with this experience of not having a self or not having a concrete self.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know where to put this, or I don't know what to do with it. And so I think that's the shift now of we shifted away from kind of spiritual, cultural, and religious reasons for doing this towards evidential or scientific based reasons.
Yeah.
And now we're kind of going, but we still need that kind of existential knowledge, and we need the
Right.
cultural and the religious and spiritual knowledge.
Yeah.
And we now kind of have to figure out how to put that piece back in a way that's accessible to a really broad audience.
Just wanted to see if Savannah, you had anything to add on any of those points, or? Oh, she's muted. Hold on, you're being unmuted.
IT is on the case.
Thank you, Nadine. Yes, I was I was wanting to contribute there. One of the things that I was thinking about here is that I was very interested in John Kabat-Zinn's follow-up research, 3-year studies on after he had trained a number of mindfulness teachers to go out and teach mindfulness into the various sectors across the states. And then they did a research on those groups that those other teachers were teaching mindfulness, and in the same kind of format, MBSR format, and they were not getting the same results. And what I found very interesting is, to John Kabat-Zinn's credit there, he wondered about this. Why weren't they getting the same results as the control studies that they had completed in Barre, Massachusetts, in the hospital there? And so what he realized was that it wasn't just being able to teach mindfulness in have a good teaching style or skill there in communication. But what he found was that the teachers needed to be embedded in the practice themselves. And then, so that there was a whole extra training. They had to have a daily practice. They needed to do retreats to really immerse themselves in the actual practice, the first person experience that you were talking about, Nicholas. And so without that, then they did some evaluations again, and they actually found that they got the same results as the initial clinical trials, because the practitioners and that were delivering mindfulness and teaching mindfulness actually were coming from more direct experience, not just a kind of teaching style, if you like, in the groups. So I guess that's kind of on one hand, the value of research. It confirms that kind of, well, that's interesting. It actually confirmed that it needs to be, mindfulness needs to be embedded in our practice in order for it to be effective, effectively communicated. So it's just another dimension of what you were talking about research. Yeah, the value of, I guess, research here.
Yeah.
I mean, if I could just say as well, I think it's also important. I mean, I think we could go kind of full nihilist, sort of, say that there is no evidence and sort of, we can't prove. And I would caution against that, because I think if evidence is only what you individually kind of can account for or believe, then we have no shared agreement on anything. And I think that undermines the enterprise of what we do as researchers and scientists, which is particularly when it comes to settings, where we're trying to sort of offer programs or offerings to a broad array of people who need help or support or coaching or whatever. We need some benchmark or some basis to understand whether or not these things are working. And I think it's quite challenging to kind of just say, asking the person, is this working for you?
Yeah.
That's going to be our benchmark, because we all of a sudden start to get into the scenario where it's very easy to persuade people that the thing is working for them. Now, all of that said, I mean, science is a subjective enterprise, and most scientists don't want to admit this, but when we get data, we have to interpret it, and we are agents in the study, right? Which is to say, we collect the data, and our beliefs and how we go about doing the work we do influences the nature of the data that we collect. And I think that's probably one of the things that we become more and more acutely aware of in the kind of crises that are going on in the scientific community now, that conflicts of interest are not just about somebody giving you money. It's also about your personal affiliations and your beliefs and your own kind of convictions. And so there's more and more movement to have teams that actually have different perspectives. And in fact, I've been part of at least one study where we did this. It's actually something called antagonistic collaboration, which is to say you get together with someone who actually disagrees with you, and you design a study where I think that A is true and if they think B is true. We both design a study together that basically works out what is the evidence that I would need to be convinced that I'm wrong and you're right, and what's the evidence that you would need in order for you to be convinced that you're wrong and I'm right. And so I think these kinds of things are big advances in terms of how we study and test these things. But it also speaks to something Savannah's hinted at, that something in scientific or psychological circles that we talk about as the translation gap, which is huge, right? That when we do these randomized controlled trials and studies in universities and tight kind of contexts and settings where the developers are offering the interventions, they work beautifully, right? There's a joke among those who are psychologists that the only person that could ever do Rogerian therapy was Carl Rogers, right? And he was really brilliant at it. And then other people went out and tried to do it, and they just couldn't do it, right? Because they weren't Carl Rogers. They weren't as good as he was with people. So the challenge then becomes, well, if you come up with a mechanism, but you can't train anybody to deliver it, then there's something wrong with not only the intervention, but the process by which you train people to do it. And so what you're talking to, Savannah, is really important in that it's not just about us figuring out how to do something ourselves, but how we can actually get it to work in the world. And that requires bigger feedback loops. We need to talk to communities about how things are working or not in the real world. And that's something that we've often fallen down on.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on something, because when I use the word evidence, I'm not merely responding to kind of quantitative studies. I'm a qualitative researcher by training, and so phenomenology is really important to me, and people's reported experience, but also their imagination and perception, because it tells us something about the human experience, right? And so how someone understands, conceives of, imagines, mindfulness, the archetypes involved in that, the logic involved in that is really important for me to draw out, and it kind of offers a more complex, messy picture of what's going on, but something that I think is significant in mindfulness studies. And so in the course, we had it peer reviewed at some point, and someone said, you're looking at Buddhism and quantitative studies, broaden it out, include qualitative studies, include phenomenological reports, ethnographies, so that you've got a sense of what's actually happening in the individual, and the interface between the social and the individual, which we'll get to in a moment. So yeah, and really what I wanted to say is that the question for qualitative researchers isn't what, does mindfulness work or not, but what are the effects of mindfulness, for the mind, heart, spirit, perception, whatever else you're studying. And so I'm really interested in what mindfulness does rather than whether it works or not according to some kind of benchmark or standard. So just to throw that in the mix.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you want to tackle the really full-on question about social issues, or?
Oh,
you
yeah.
go for it now?
No, sure. Why not? Thanks, Nadine. Thanks for keeping us on track, mate. Okay, I'll just tell you an experience. I was sitting in Singapore, I was just come back from Singapore, and sitting in Singapore airport, distracting myself with this ridiculous thing, and I had my first panic attack ever. Yeah, not a serious one, just a mild panic attack. Somebody's on a tweet, somebody said that the year over global CO2 had increased 5.69 parts per million. Most recent year over increase, 5.6 parts per million, which is, if you haven't been following the metric, that doesn't mean anything to you, but that's just shocking. That's just unbelievable. Normally it's been 1 or 2 parts per million. And for 5.69, I mean, obviously it's a fluctuation. It doesn't mean it's a trend. But when I saw that, I couldn't breathe. I was sitting in the middle of Singapore airport and just thinking, oh my God, I hope a monk doesn't faint in the middle of the airport. And just that feeling of just so much out of control. And I mean, I was sitting here, you know, every so often trying to be mindfulness of my breathing as I'm sitting here, and I'm looking out the window and it's a bloody gale going on there at the moment. And the wind is going, and I don't know, I kind of feel it's a good metaphor for how we are in our practice. When we come and we sit in a nice quiet room and nice and peaceful, and then outside storming. And if we can find a place of stillness and peace in there, that's kind of amazing, right? And I think that's one of the great, not the great promise, but the great gift of contemplative awareness is once you've had that experience, you know it, and nobody can take it away from you. And no matter what it says in any book, no matter what anybody says, no matter what any evidence says, no matter, you know what that is like. And that state of peace comes from letting go, of course. So that's an inestimable treasure of mindfulness practice and contemplative practice. We do live in interesting times, and they are only going to get more interesting. And climate change, or as these days I call it, escalating global chaos, and energy pumped into the atmosphere and into the world, and destabilization, and the horrifying wars that are going on at the moment, Gaza, Ukraine, and still underreported or not reported at all in Myanmar as well. And how we're connected to all of this, and yet we're connected to it in ways that have no concern for our well-being, right? This is not like somebody you love saying, oh, I have some bad news, do you want to sit down, right? This is just given to us, right? So we have to have a capacity in ourselves to prepare ourselves for these things, to keep them limited, to not get addicted to social media, have to take responsibility for these things. Just remember that all of the people who are building these things, all the people who built these apps, built Facebook, built Twitter, who built all these things, they are not your friends. And they did not do this for your well-being. They did this so that you would get addicted to them and they can make money. So don't fall into their trap. And we have to have that kind of capacity. But to do that on a basis of discipline is going to fail. You have to do it on a basis of understanding who you are and understanding what matters and what values matter to yourself. And I think this comes back to that idea of like I guess you call it like shallow mindfulness, right? I'm just going to solve my workplace stress by mindfulness, or actually having some kind of path. One of the things that we find in ABCAP, Subhana and Enkong and those who've been doing the ABCAP course is it's run for therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists with at least 5 years clinical experience. They come to do the course because they want that something deeper. Mm-hmm. That's what we found. Almost all of them. They know how to treat people and alleviate the symptoms, but what happens there? Yeah, and precisely that question, Nicola, you asked, like, you know, what happens when you ask your therapist, you know, what is this self? Well, that's if the therapist can't answer that, they need to come and do the ABCAT course. Then they'll have a nice straightforward answer to that, I'm sure. But so yeah, this is the thing. But the other dimension of it is, of course, the relationship between mindfulness and actually doing stuff, like being an activist. And on the one hand, I don't want to see a world where good people spend their time meditating instead of actually stopping all this stuff happening. On the other hand, people are different. I mean, a lot of people are not going to be out there on the streets and protesting. And I think that to assume that everyone must be an activist also, I think, is lacking compassion. Yeah, I think people act in their own way, in their own community, and doesn't always mean wandering down the street waving their flag.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Kind of leads me into my next question, and I'd like to direct this to Savannah. I mean, basically, since the decrease of religion in our society and the fragmentation of our social fabric through all sorts of mechanisms, including social media, what we've seen for a lot of people is a crisis of meaning and purpose. And the statistics on loneliness are also quite remarkable as well. I read a study the other day that indicated that a large proportion of Australians, something like 30%, only have one or two friends, which kind of surprised me. So on all sorts of levels, people are struggling psychologically and socially. And I think, you know, AI will probably contribute to this, and parasocial relationships, cyber culture, etc. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about how mindfulness might address some of these issues, Savannah?
Well, that's a wonderful question, Nadine. I think it does. I think that I've been really concerned about the degree of loneliness and isolation and feelings of alienation too, that a lot of people, it has been exacerbated after the pandemic. And I was just in Victoria recently, just last weekend, at a wedding, a Buddhist wedding. And yeah, there was the increase of loneliness there, particularly in young people, is really quite a phenomenon that a lot of psychologists and therapists are concerned about. And because of all their series of lockdowns, you know, that really had a very severe impact there on the community, and still is, there's still the fallout there. So the way I think about mindfulness here is that it brings us into present moment experience and present relationship, the engagement with the immediacy of experience and with people and our environment. Whereas the social media platforms and the screens are two-dimensional screens, and you don't get other than Zoom, which is a wonderful advent, but in most kind of social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or some of those other apps, you're not getting immediate feedback. You're not getting that instant kind of repartee and emotional connectedness and empathy and rapport. There's not, as they say, the immediate feedback you get from face-to-face or engagement with present moment experience and direct connection is really, really healthy for our sense of well-being and sense of feeling emotionally attuned and valued and connected in our world, in our relational world. And so mindfulness really adds a dimension to that. You know, it really brings us into relationship with each other. And this alleviates a sense of aloneness and disconnection. So I was fascinated with a particular podcast that is a scientific podcast in America about loneliness, and they were having wonderful researchers on that podcast, and they were researching about the neuroscience of two-dimensional screens, how without that immediate interaction and present moment experience in a way with the felt sense of the embodiment of connection, the brain interprets, when we look at a computer screen and or Facebook or social media, the brain interprets that as loneliness, because we're not getting the immediate feedback of presence and energy and connection. And I found that absolutely fascinating. It's like we think, a lot of people, young people, think they're getting that lot of a connectedness by jumping on Facebook or Twitter or kind of social media platforms, but actually the brain's interpreting that as lonely. And that's counterintuitive in a way. I mean, it's only because of this research that is fascinating. I thought, wow, we've got a whole generation of people who are now tagged into that social media platforms, and that is actually quite detrimental in many ways for their emotional well-being. So hence, I think mindfulness has a really important role here to bring back this kind of engagement in present moment, face-to-face, if you like, is the most ideal. It's that engagement and immediacy of interactive experience with one another. We are really shaping each other's brain in that present moment experience. So mindfulness adds a depth of connection. We know that from when we sit on retreats and sit in mindfulness, even with a group of people who are incredibly silent, there's this powerful sense of connection, a deeper connection than just even the verbal connection. So yes, I feel like it gives greater sense of meaning and depth of connection, and alleviates that sense of loneliness and isolation. We really do feel that interconnectedness. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I think it kind of challenges this idea that mindfulness is an individual pursuit, and that mindfulness is something that happens simply on the inside. I think you're referring to a kind of interpersonal, communal mindfulness that often arises on retreats and elsewhere. So yeah, thank you. Okay, so Nicholas, I know that a lot of people have talked about spiritual and social bypassing over the last 10 years. So this idea that you're just glossing over a lot of your, say, deep psychological wounding or social suffering, and using mindfulness as a way to kind of escape it rather than face it. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about that and some of the evidence in relation to mindfulness.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to a colleague of mine about a week or two ago, and I don't know what the nature of the conversation was, but I kind of had a very flippant comment to her at the end of which she expressed some very sincere distress over something, and we were talking about meditation, kind of commercialized mindfulness, and so I said, just sit with that. And I think that's an expression that can be very profound if you're a teacher and you're working in the right context with someone. Just sit with that, see how it feels, see what it feels like for you. But it can also be quite flippant if you're in the context of being in a Singaporean airport and sort of hearing some terrible news and someone saying, just sit with it. What's so bad? You can go in your body and feel it. What you need in those kind of moments is not to feel more of that. You need something else, right? You need some comfort and support. So I mean, this whole idea of spiritual bypassing or social bypassing, I think is really speaking to the fact that some of the way in which these practices, particularly the commercial forms of them, are getting implemented are, and I never thought I'd quote Coldplay, but are part of, the questions that are they part of the cure or part of the disease, right? So I think they're an implementation or manifestation of the disease. We want them to be part of the cure, but it's this broken system. And rather than actually helping people to dig in and figure out what's going on that's really wrong, why are young people feeling so isolated and disconnected? We're giving them more tools that look as if they address the problem on the surface, but they actually make them feel more isolated and more disconnected. And so I think what we're kind of starting to realize, but not enough, because the monetary incentives of these products and, particularly I'm thinking about, like, say, Headspace and Calm. I mean, Calm in and of itself is $1 billion company. And Headspace similarly sort of is operating in a way, and I don't mean Headspace, the the mental health group, I mean, Headspace, the app, which is quite an important distinction. But they're now operating as health organizations, health and wellness organizations. And so they're really kind of, at least on the surface of it, suggesting that they can help you address these really big issues or problems, but they're not doing that. And so they're basically guilty of the very thing we're talking about, you know, spiritual bypassing, social bypassing, in that they're saying, we get that this is a really big problem, but why don't you have our app? During the pandemic, people who lost their jobs in the US were given free access to Headspace. And so growing up in the US, you know, one of the things I thought is, if you're not very well off in the US, paying your mobile phone bill can be extremely challenging. They're very variable, unlike in Australia, where you get the same amount every month. And I'm always confused by that here. Like, how is it the same amount every month? In the US, they're all over the place. There's extra charges. And so the idea that you would give someone this app when they've lost their job, it feels like a slap in the face. Like, why would you want that? Like, what you want is a job. Right? But somehow you're giving them free access to an app that they may not even be able to access. And even worse than that, if you know something about the kind of the ways in which many of these apps operate, to access free trials, you often have to enter your personal information and credit card details. And then they make it incredibly difficult for you to cancel those subscriptions. So what they've done is they've taken people who have just lost their jobs. They said, here's something that you may not even be able to use because you may not be able to pay for your phone. And now we want your credit card details and your personal information. And you might get hit with a bill 12 months from now for something that you've never used. So I think when we look at sort of how mindfulness and meditation are being used in the broader commercial sense, I think it really epitomizes the core of the problem, which is that it's too easy for these organizations, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit. There's lots of not-for-profit orgs as well that kind of do a wonderful song and dance. I don't mean Nantien. Nantien is doing wonderful work, but there's some organizations out there that do a wonderful song and dance about how they're really trying to help people manage mental health and deal with loneliness. But in reality, what they offer is just another version of the sort of social or spiritual bypassing, where they're giving people kind of kitschy tools that seem nice and sound good, but they don't really kind of help them to address the underlying problem. And so I think the challenge then is for all of us, for those that are in this room, for those that are listening, to really actually push this as a topic of conversation with people in the world and with the organizations and the cultures that we interact with on exactly this topic, and really to try to get people to think about, to what extent are these versions that are very superficial of the stuff that many of us care very deeply about harming the potential of these practices that we know, or we believe at least, can make a really big difference. Which is to say that if mindfulness, and just going back to one of the first comments I made, if mindfulness sort of is, you know, coloring in, and it's also what you do on a Buddhist retreat, the fact that people get really sick of coloring in becomes a threat to the thing that you do on the Buddhist retreat. Because you talk to an average person on the street, and they may go, well, I tried mindfulness, I'm not interested. You go, well, what did you try? I tried coloring in. Like, that's what they said is mindfulness. You go, well, no, that's not mindfulness. And I go, well, what do you mean? This expert told me that that was mindfulness, right? Andrew Puttycombe, you know, he's an expert, right? He gave me mindfulness. I see him on TV. He's been on Oprah, right? Must be an expert. So, I mean, I think we have to push that idea, and we really have to challenge it, because otherwise I think the entire enterprise of what we're doing is really at risk. The potential that we're actually talking about fundamentally here, and this is something that the center I direct, the Mindfulness Study Center, like, the reason why we exist is in part to kind of try to address the concern that the fact that we think these practices can really help people and can deal with deeper, broader existential issues or spiritual issues is under threat from these very superficial commercial forms of the practices.
Yeah, fabulous. And Bhante, I know that you've got some views around commodification and co-opting of, well, you did express them to me. They might have been empty and they're gone now.
Yeah.
Yeah, just do you have anything to add around, you know, big multinationals and larger organizations co-opting mindfulness and some of the risks and opportunities, not just risks?
Yeah. So it's a hard one, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that I've been emphasizing recently that seems to be taking people by surprise is the idea of right livelihood. So right livelihood is one of those many things which kind of gets stripped out of mindfulness and then gets put back in. So you have mindful livelihood now, but has been there all along, right? And the very idea of sort of modern secular mindfulness largely is driven by stress from work, right? You talked about the origins of the movement and stress and so on. Well, where does that stress come from? Mostly from work and financial stress and so on. And so people are conditioned from the beginning to see mindfulness as a way, as an antidote to it's like the solution to the problems that your work has created, right? But the idea of right livelihood is that livelihood is part of the Noble Eightfold Path. Livelihood is an essential support for mindfulness. You couldn't be doing mindfulness and meditation basically unless you've got a job, right? I mean, you have to have somewhere you can sit, right? You have to actually have a life in which you can practice mindfulness, and to do that, you have to have a livelihood. And so to flip it around and to think that right livelihood is that your job is not that which stands in the way of your peace, but your job is an essential component of the path to your peace, right? That's really kind of a way of flipping it around. But then, of course, the question then becomes, well, is it though? Right? Because if you're working for, let's say, Amazon on the shop floor and you're walking, 30 kilometers a day or something like that, and you're exhausted, and they have a little pod, I don't know if you've seen their wellness pods in Amazon. It's like a little phone booth or something that you can step in, and they've got like new age music. And you'll sort of sit in there and it'll have a little screen and it'll do like a mindfulness thing for you. And it's like sitting on the warehouse floor, and you go in there and like it's like dystopian nightmare fuel. And and the whole question about the ethics of livelihood as well, right? I mean, are we contributing to the destruction of the planet? Are we just contributing to all of these things? So, and the question of meaning, right? How is the work that I'm doing meaningful? One of the things that really was really beautiful when I was a young monk in Thailand, every year when the harvest came, the local villagers, they all grew sticky rice in northeast Thailand, and they would harvest the sticky rice, and then the first harvest of the year they would cook and they would bring to the monastery and they'd offer to the Sangha. So the first rice of the new year was always offered to the Sangha, and then we would have it, and then the whole village would come and everybody would share, and this whole celebration of that work and that life that they had done. And to me, that's so beautiful. And that connection between what you're doing and the meaning of it, the purpose of it. You're feeding yourself, feeding your family, feeding the community, feeding the Sangha. It's spiritual, it's religious, it's everything. All of those things are together, brought in with the simple act of sharing a meal together. When I went to the US, we did a retreat in California and Santa Barbara. Hi, the folks from Santa Barbara, is anyone there? And for the retreat, everyone brought their own food. I'd never seen that before. Like normally you either share the food or you get catering or something, but everyone had their own, because I think everyone has so many dietary requirements now, right? It's just too much of a hassle to try to organize food. And so it just took this huge element out of it, right? Everybody, I've got my own thing. And that communal sharing was gone. So I don't know, I feel like I feel like our kind of modern, urban and secularized Dharma practice has been constructed on the dismissal of village Buddhism and the denial of the meaning and the relevance of they're just doing superstitions, blah, 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 all of these things. But to me, village Buddhism is one of the most meaningful things. And you see just like simple people living their lives, and the Dharma provides them with values and some kind of sense of bringing people together and some kind of sense of meaning. And I think, as I say, for example, Nam Tien's initiative for the communities of practice, I see that as like a way of restoring or trying to restore that idea. Yeah, restoring that connection. And I think that's something that we really need to look at. It's not just about, you know, those individual practices that you're doing, but it's about that broader context. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which includes work,
Yes,
right livelihood. Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah, we're at work a lot of the time.
yeah. So you're lucky you get to do right livelihood.
It's pretty good.
And you get to do right livelihood. And so, yeah, so do you. And some, I don't know about the other people, you guys do. Livelihood. So hopefully everyone here does right livelihood. Anybody out there who's like a drug dealer or a weapons manufacturer, professional assassins, and so on, then, well, there's some room for growth, I guess.
The Buddha would not turn them away either.
The Buddha would absolutely not turn them away, because it's a challenge, right? If that's your skill and that's your livelihood, it's not easy to get a new one.
Okay. Look, I might just offer one more question to Sabana, and then I'll open it up for some other questions from the floor. Sabana, I know that, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, mindfulness is very much about right understanding and gaining insight into self, other, world. And I wondered how you teach secular mindfulness and how you draw on the wisdom of the Buddha in secular settings.
Yes, well, what you've summarized there, Nadine, is yes, that's also how we teach mindfulness in the secular kind of more secular kind of frame, if you like. In the mindfulness and compassion teacher training course, mindfulness is also, we refer to the deep roots of the tradition. I want people to understand the deep roots of the tradition. So I want them to understand and know about the teachings in the Pali Canon and what the Buddha said about mindfulness. And so there's a direct connection with study and being able to study that, refer to those teachings. And so we take a whole year, for example, to take up the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And the first foundation, the first module is all about the first foundation, which is body, breath, sensations, and movement. The second foundation of mindfulness is mindfulness of Vedana, which is pleasant and unpleasant and neutral. And the third foundation of mindfulness is mindfulness of the mind, and the concepts and ideas and consciousness and the different mind states that we experience. And the fourth foundation is mindfulness of the Dharma. And so, which encapsulates anicca, dukkha, anatta. These are the Pali words of impermanence and causes of suffering, and the not self teachings, the deep wisdom teachings of the selfless domain. So, you know, even though people are teaching in various secular settings, whether it's hospitals or yoga studios or health department or education or corporate world, part of the training is to understand those deep roots. And yes, how to translate and what is the language that one would develop that would be able to inform that person to deliver that meditation and mindfulness and compassion in those secular settings so that it is appropriate. Yeah, so that is, the course is designed in that way. Don't know if that totally answers your question, but
Yeah, I think it does. And you've mentioned that link with compassionate action as well, which I think, as Bhante said, you know, the Brahmaviharas are a part of the way you teach mindfulness, even in these secular settings.
yes. And so for the second year of that course is we take up the Brahmaviharas, so the module on love and then compassion, joy, and equanimity. So we take the whole second year is on the boundless heart teachings. And so mindfulness is the base of that, informs and how we, it's an extension of mindfulness, is the boundless heart teachings. So from there, in the Zen tradition, compassionate action is a very integral part of the practice. And it's been well developed, probably even more so in the Zen tradition than the Insight tradition. So we actually have very clear kind of practices around engaged Buddhism and engaged Buddha Dharma. And so that engagement with in the bringing compassionate action into the world is based on 3 principles. The first principle is mindfulness and not knowing. The quality of not being, being able to move into a situation where one doesn't have, not knowing is a philosophy of not having, you're full of ideas and expectations and how you think should be, but really a deep listening and deep resonance with the situation. So the principle of not knowing leads into the principle and practice of bearing witness, which is a mindfulness and being able to bear witness to the suffering, to the difficulty, the climate crisis or Indigenous issues and so on, whatever the issues are. So bearing witness is an ability to hold oneself steady with equanimity in the face of difficult circumstances and situations. And then bearing witness leads into compassionate action. So in the Zen tradition, there is a whole philosophy, teachings, practices, workshops that we do on not knowing, bearing witness, the 3 tenets of engaged Buddhism. So there's, and that's been well developed by, throughout the world in the peace order of the Zen peace order. And so it's an international network of engaged Buddhist practice. So there's a real concern about not just having mindfulness and compassion for one's own liberation and well-being and happiness, but the deeper Buddhist philosophy of the Bodhisattva path is to take that practice and also engage in the world. It's to alleviate the suffering in the world. And so it requires skillful action, skillful means. And so how can we do that? So, yeah, there is a whole path there that's well developed and integrated and an integral part of the Zen practice particularly. It's there in the Insight tradition. And of course, Bhante is a brilliant example of that, an embodiment of that. I guess it's not so explicit in the Insight tradition. Depends on the teacher, but there's not such a formal kind of practice and philosophy embedded in that social action. I just happen to be blessed with the teachers that I have been involved in and studied with over many years, that they were very supportive of socially engaged action and taking the practice from the cushion to the streets. And literally, I've done street sessions where we've actually gone out into the streets of Sydney and did a whole retreat, several retreats where we engaged into the street life of Sydney, sitting in Martin Place, sitting in the malls, sitting, going down to the soup kitchens, going out to the refugees, places at Villawood when that centre was in Sydney. So there was a whole engagement with right action and engaged Buddhist philosophy there that I would like to see more, more developed, I guess.
Savannah, it also comes the other way, as we saw Savannah and I work together with the CSIRO on climate change anxiety. And I've been teaching meditation with them for a number of years. And you see that, it can hardly get more scientific secular than the literal Commonwealth scientific body. And they, many people, they're looking for something, right? Because they feel that sense of loss, that feel a sense of alienation and anxiety. when was it? I think 2016 or something like that. They all got to work, and then they all had an email saying that climate change was no longer a priority for the CSIRO. And they felt, they've been giving this message to the government and the powers that be for so many years, and no one's listening. And they're looking at all these changes. I asked one of my friends there, Kamar, how has climate change affected your field of study? She said, my field of study doesn't exist anymore. And she studied the marine kelp forests, and they're just gone. She said, it's just desert now. And so it's not just from this cushion to the streets, if you like, but also the other way, right? From the streets, or in this case, the lab, to the cushion. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a very special, wonderful experience to work with the scientists and their interest in mindfulness, because a lot of their funding had been axed and they were very despairing at the time about what was happening. They couldn't even send their reports to the government. The Liberal government didn't even want to hear their reports. And these are leading scientists, and so they were very keen, and they reached out to want something like mindfulness to kind of deal with their level of emotional distress. And that was a really great privilege to be part of that. So yeah, there's that interchange, isn't there? That's right.
Okay, so we might take some questions. So maybe firstly from in the room, and then I'll hop around to where Josh is sitting. And oh, you've got the Rod. Wonderful. Okay, let's take one from in the room, and then I'll see if Rod, perhaps you could field a question for us. So anyone in the room wanting to ask a panelist a question?
Huge list of questions there.
They're not questions. They're
just not.
questions. These are the questions.
These are the questions.
Yeah, there's more. There's more.
Oh, no, thank
So
you.
there's no pressure. I just don't want to be the only one asking questions.
We don't mind.
No questions from, yes.
From an education perspective, there is certainly great interest in mindfulness, and particularly for children and challenging behaviours. And yet there seems to be also writings that in fact mindfulness may be harmful for children. So I'm interested because there is such a tension, and we have teachers who wanting to support children and seeking advice, seeking guidance, and where we go.
Sure. So I mean, we haven't talked about it today, but it's something I talk about a lot. There was a study that was done not that long ago in the UK called the Myriad study. And it's a really, really notable study for a number of reasons. One of which is that there were over 8,000 school children enrolled in this study. And they were randomized to get either a mindfulness-based intervention or standard socio-emotional learning as usual. It was a really expensive study. It was really long study. Willem Kuyken, the lead researcher in charge of the study, said it, it's basically a decade of his life that he spent planning, implementing, analyzing the data. Not only did it not work, there was no benefit of mindfulness over and above socio-emotional learning.
Over and above what, sorry?
What's that? Over and above socio-emotional learning.
Socio-emotional learning.
Yes, which is kind of our standard wellness program for kids in schools. We teach them about emotions and social connections and why that's important and valuable, and how they think about and use that.
Okay.
So mindfulness programs were added on top of that. So there was no added value to introducing mindfulness. But a particularly important point is that those, and these were secondary school children, those kids who had mental health issues before going into this, a number of them ended up worse off as a result of the mindfulness training, and that they did not observe that in the comparison group. So many people view this as a failed study. It's not a failed study. It's a really, really well-designed study. It just had negative results. We didn't see what we wanted to see. That doesn't mean it's a failed study. But it's a really important thing that those of us sort of who work in the space consider, because it means that unlike what we've been saying for a very long time, that we can teach mindfulness to kids in schools in a very one-size-fits-all way, that's probably not the case. You know, we have evidence that now that suggests that that's not true, and in fact that may be harmful. So I think where that then leaves us in a position, where that leaves us is in the position that we need to take a step back and say, okay, one-size-fits-all approaches don't seem to work. Us developing or offering mindfulness programs in schools that are largely developed and inspired based on programs for adults probably don't make sense. And we really need to rethink the whole way that we're doing these kinds of things with kids, because some of the key consultants that were not part of the process of rolling out these programs were the young people themselves. And so, you know, one of the biggest sort of results that many people talked about from the study was the kids just didn't do the practice. They didn't like it. It was competing. I mean, one kid in particular said that, or his mother turned up to a comment session and said, "My son hates you," this is to Willem, a colleague of mine at Oxford, "because you made him do mindfulness instead of soccer. And he loves soccer. Mindfulness replaced his soccer. And that was to him was like the most important thing, right?" And so it's just this example of where, you know, we may have the best intentions, but if we're not actually thinking about, well, how does this fit with the people for whom we're using, in particular kids, I think, you know, what is it they're ready to do? What is it that is going on already in their lives? How do we make use of the things that they have? And then also thinking about the practice that we offer. Is it actually presented at a level that they can engage with? I often quote a Bluey episode when I'm talking about kids and mindfulness, because there's this beautiful episode called Chess, where it's about the dad wants to teach the young girls chess. And at the end of the episode, the mom says, "Work on their hearts now, we'll deal with their heads later." And it's a beautiful saying, and it's a wonderful analogy, I think, to kind of what you often hear in Buddhist circles, is that when you're young, you know, we're really working on just cultivating the heart stuff. The head stuff is too advanced. And so if it's insight-based practices and things like that, you know, kind of mindfulness, the way we often teach it, it's going to be well above what most kids under a certain age are going to be prepared to deal with. And so we really have to think about how we adapt these programs. We can't just use mindfulness as usual. We can't just use one-size-fits-all mindfulness. And practices like loving kindness and compassion and cultivate those kind of cultivation practices are probably just going to work a lot better. But, you know, we need evidence for that, and we need to start testing things out. So that's where we're at. Like, lots of teachers are absolutely right. They want to do this. They're desperate for something. They want something for themselves. And that was one thing in the study, that the teachers did actually get better. They had benefit because they learned the practice and they felt better about it. But that didn't flow on to have impact for the kids. So we have to figure out, well, how do we actually meet the kids where they're at? And how do we meet the demand that's there? And just throwing apps into the room, or throwing these one-size-fits-all packages into the room at really busy teachers who don't have any time in their day to do it, to kids who are really stressed out and have, you know, so many things they have to achieve in their day, and then expecting parents at home to try to understand it, it's just not going to work. So we've kind of got to do a 180 and rethink the whole way that we're doing this, recognizing that there is incredible demand, particularly in the educational space.
And my question very quickly was because of the apps, and it's the availability for teachers, and you know, teachers are always looking for the recipe for success, and that's concerning.
I mean, I think something I was certainly in my son's school, I have an 8-year-old son, and I think when the individual teachers kind of have more buy-in, and when it's sort of about the teacher connecting with the students, I think it works better. And I mean, one of the things I've been advocating for with a lot of teachers when we've been doing consultation work via the Campbell Study Center is this idea that let's give people options. Like, contemplative practices are not one thing. It doesn't just need to be mindfulness, right? Particularly with kids, we could give them an opportunity to do some mindful movement, or, you know, sit outside quietly, or wander around and look at the cloud. I mean, kids are naturally mindful. We don't need to teach it to them. So just give them the space and say, here's a number of activities. Choose one that resonates with you. The beautiful thing about that as well is it starts to, in the secular space, it starts to allow for kids who are coming from a religious background to actually take advantage of that. If you're Muslim and you want to pray, great, here's your space in the day to do it, right? If you're Buddhist and you want to meditate, do it, right? So it allows a space in the school that actually everyone is allowed something different, and it allows for everybody kind of to explore different things with the support, I think, that you really need of a bit of a monitoring of like, okay, is this actually working? An evaluation of, okay, maybe this thing that somebody is doing is actually not helpful. So we need to be careful about how we let that roll.
Yes.
But no one ever called. So can I just speak briefly to that as well? Like, I know nothing about children and I know nothing about education or anything like that, okay? But when we were doing an event to support the voice, and we did a book called Statements from the Soul. And one of the events we did, I was talking with one of the women who was, of course, a co-contributor. And she told me about her experience. They set up an orphanage in northern Queensland to look after, sorry, my apologies. Literally no one ever thought this. Why clapping? Okay, so basically they're running like an orphanage or a place for girls from broken homes, yeah, you know, domestic abuse background, domestic violence background, alcoholism, and all of these things. And so all of these Aboriginal girls, right, most of them think like sort of preteen or young teenagers. And she said when they started, it was a nightmare, right? Because they were all just acting out, they're all fighting, they're all doing these things, and they just spent their whole life trying to discipline these girls and try to get them to sit in the classroom and do these things. But they introduced a Didiri practice, which is the Aboriginal contemplative practice. I don't know much about it, but it's some kind of contemplative and reflective practice that they introduced. And she said that once they'd done that, after some time of doing that, the girls grew to really love it, and all of those behavioural problems went away. She said, we just don't have them anymore because they learned as a group. It's a communal thing. It's culturally appropriate way of bringing it in. They learned how to discuss their differences. They learned how to emotionally regulate, and they learned how to function, you know, in a way that they hadn't learned coming from broken homes.
Savannah, do you want to say something? I think she's muted again, is she?
No, that's okay. Yes, I was wanting to just offer a little bit about my direct experience of actually at one stage in my life, I was a preschool teacher. So I was teaching very young children. And I absolutely loved that. I had about sort of 10 4-year-olds under my care. And one of the ways that I really related to what you were saying, Bante, about Dadiri is a Aboriginal word that means deep listening, and sitting down on the ground and deep listening to the earth and to nature and to everything moment by moment. And so that deep listening practice is one thing that I used to do with the children. And we would go out into nature, and in a way I was teaching them mindfulness, but I wasn't calling it mindfulness. We went out into the nature, and we'd sit with a tree and we'd breathe with the tree, and we'd connect with the kind of everything, all the environment around us. And so, you know, it's just wandering in the bush and sitting on the earth and lighting fires and all kinds of bringing in the elements and connecting with the natural world. And the children absolutely loved it, and they always felt this kind of calmness. And we would also have moments of quiet time in the preschool. Not just story time, but quiet time, and we would make a game of, well, how quiet can we be here? and the children would just really take it on board. Can you count 10 breaths? You know, can you be quiet and mindful? Can you breathe together? There was lots of ways in which I just experimented with using mindfulness with the children, but not in a kind of formal way, you know. And those children were just so wonderful to be with, and they just resonated with visualizations, with loving kindness, with mindfulness in nature. So I do think what you're saying, Nicholas, is, well, how do we bring this into the education environment? And it has to be age appropriate, has to connect with the children, it has to be resonate with what their needs are. It's not just a one size fits all. I totally agree with you. But I do feel there's a powerful offering there. And I know my son and my daughter, both who, when I was the preschool teacher, my daughter was part of that. She was 4 years old at the time. And so she loved it. The children were really resonated with this practice. So I do think there needs to be lots of creative ways in which we deliver that to younger age groups. You know, the way that mindfulness is taught in the currently is very an adult practice. We see most mature aged people coming into into mindfulness. So I think we need to get more creative about how we do that.
Great, thank you, Sabana. So we've got a few questions online, and we probably won't be able to take them all because we're 5 minutes before the end of this event. So I might just ask one, and perhaps you could shorten your responses, panelists, to 1 or 2 sentences. And I'm gonna ask you one of the one of the most simple questions, which is, if there's time, can the panelists respond to what guidance would you offer to those who are struggling to establish a consistent mindfulness practice in a busy life? You go first.
I may go first. Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Nadine. That's a great question. Thanks to whoever asked it. I saw the question there. Okay, so I'm going to give you my standard advice to this. Okay, number 1, you've got to do a meditation practice, and you've got to do 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week. Okay, and let me just ask, is there anybody here who cannot do 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week? You can all do that? Yes? Yes? 5 days, 20 minutes a day, because 20 minutes a day is enough to let your mind get peaceful and you actually see the benefit of it. 5 days a week, because you're going to miss a day, and then you miss a day, and then you'll be like, oh, cool, I can even miss another day and I'm still good, right? So 5 days a week, okay? So is there anybody here who can't do that? No, everybody seems to be okay. So now can I ask everybody, will you do that? Will you make a commitment to do that? Are you going to do that? You wouldn't lie to a monk, would you? 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, right? And one of the things that I also recommend, to come back to that right livelihood thing that we're talking about, is to use working from home makes it harder because it's got it all merges into one, right? But if you're still going to work, or even if you're working at home, try to use the space between your home life and your work life as a zone to reflect on right livelihood. So when you leave your house, or when you get ready to start your work, if you're working from home, then just reflect to yourself, say, now I'm going to start my right livelihood. I'm going to try to practice right livelihood as best as I can during the day. And that means doing what I can to help people. It means treating my colleagues with respect. It means doing my work with integrity, and all of those other things. So I'm going to try to do that as best as I can for the period while I'm at work. And then when you're finished, then before you begin, then reflect that now my work is over. Okay. You say, you remind yourself of all of the good things you've done during that day. Okay. And you give thanks. I'm not sure the government was going to put this thing saying you can't be emailed by your boss, right? You've got a freedom from being emailed. Did that get through? Did that get through? Okay, well then you can give either thanks to the government for introducing this legislation, or a prayer that they will introduce it if it hasn't been introduced, right? So you can leave your work behind and rejoice in the fact that you did that good work. And when you come to meditate, then you use that as a grounds for giving yourself joy. Just remind yourself, I tried to help people today. I tried to do something good, whatever way that I could, and then use that as a basis for joy and meditation.
Thank you. Sabana, any quick words you'd like to add?
1 minute.
Well, I think that if you cannot find time to actually do a formal sitting practice in your daily life, like Bante's wonderful hard sell there. I think there's so many opportunities to thread mindfulness through your daily life activities, like choosing certain things. For me, in the morning, I love going down, making a cup of tea first thing in the morning. I have to have my cup of tea. And so I do that, make that cup of tea with a lot of mindfulness, and then bring it up to my meditation cushion and sit and drink my tea mindfully. Or if it's stacking the dishwasher or sweeping the floor, there you can just use that as a bracket of mindfulness. You can just take a little bit more time to kind of sweep the floor or stack the dishwasher mindfully. So in other words, mindfulness doesn't have to be just relegated to the cushion. It can be threaded through the whole of your life. Or you can just pause before you answer the phone, take a deep breath. Hello. There is many opportunities in terms of the rituals of our daily life, and just those daily life activities, whether it's brushing your teeth. Just choose some of those activities that are regular kind of practices in our daily life, and then those can be places of mindfulness. Because when we bring mindfulness to the ordinary activities of our daily life, it transforms them into the sacred in a way. They become a sacred expression for our life. Yeah? And rather than just thinking of those activities as something to get out of the way and get on to the better things or the more important things of our life and our daily life, those activities become places of it's almost like little wells of refuge, wells of mindfulness that we can take and thread through our day. It's just kind of a reset moment. So I'm offering that as a kind of way to thread it through your life.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. I want to thank our wonderful panelists and for all of you coming here, paying attention, being mindful for the 2 hours, which I know is a long stint, and your wonderful questions, which we've taken note of. So just some housekeeping things at the end. We are recording this, and I will send you all a recording of this in the next few days. And I'll also let you know of the inquiry email if you've got any inquiries about the course, because I've got quite a few on chat that we weren't able to respond to. And I also have a request for the names and details of each speaker. I'll do that and provide a website link as well for each speaker. So thank you all. It's been a delightful afternoon, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bante. Thank you, Nicholas. Wonderful, wonderful.